My name is Ethan Miller. I was 28 years old when I learned that the people I was supposed to trust the most had betrayed me. The news came out of nowhere, like a slap to the face, unexpected, painful, and impossible to ignore. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind where everything felt routine. I had just finished work and was about to make coffee when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway, not knowing that this single call would change everything. "Hi, is this Ethan Miller?" "Yes, who's this?" I asked, still distracted as I stirred sugar into my cup. "My name is Karen. I'm calling regarding the sale of your property. Just wanted to confirm the final details before we close the paperwork." The words didn't register at first. Sale? Property? My brows furrowed. "You must have the wrong number," I said, lifting the phone to my ear properly, now giving the conversation my full attention. There was a pause. "Oh, I apologize. I was told the property was owned by the Miller family. Your parents completed the sale last week." I stopped breathing for a second. My fingers tightened around the mug, my heart thudding in slow, heavy beats. "What sale?" My voice came out sharper than I intended. Another pause, this time more hesitant. I assumed you were aware. The house has been sold, Mr. Miller. The deal was finalized last week." For a long moment, I couldn't move. The words echoed in my head, but they made no sense. The house? Our house? Was gone? Sold? Without my knowledge? That was impossible. Without another word, I hung up and immediately dialed my mother's number. It rang twice before she picked up, her voice light, casual, completely unaware of the storm brewing on my end. "Ethan, honey, how are you?" I gritted my teeth. "Tell me it's not true," I said, my voice dangerously calm. A small pause. "What's not true, sweetheart?" "The house," I snapped. "Did you sell it?" There was a brief silence, followed by a sigh. "Oh, that," she said, brushing it off like it was a minor inconvenience. "Yes, we did. Your father and I thought it was for the best." A strange numbness spread through my chest. "For the best?" I repeated, gripping the phone so tightly my fingers ached. "You sold our family home without telling me? Without even asking me?" "It's just a house, Ethan," she said, her tone completely dismissive. "You never lived there anyway. What's the big deal?" "Just a house." I felt my stomach twist. My mother had never been sentimental, but this was something else. "It's not just a house," I said through clenched teeth. "It's my house. It belonged to Grandma and Grandpa. You had no right. It was still under our name," she cut in smoothly, "and we needed the money." My breath caught. "For what?" There was a shuffle on the other end of the line, and then I heard my father's voice in the background. "Just tell him, Sharon. He'll find out anyway." A part of me braced for something serious. Maybe a medical bill, an emergency, something that would at least justify what they had done. But then my mother said something that knocked the air right out of my lungs. "We used it for a vacation." I went completely still. The sounds around me faded. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant chatter from the street outside, even my own breathing. A vacation?" My voice came out quiet, almost like I was asking if I had heard correctly. "Yes, Europe," she said brightly. "Your father and I have always wanted to see Italy, and we figured why not? We deserved it." A bitter taste filled my mouth. They had taken something irreplaceable and cashed it in for a few weeks of luxury. "You deserved it?" I echoed, my voice eerily calm. "Of course," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Ethan, it's not like you were ever going to live there. You're always so busy with work. What do you even need it for?" I swallowed hard, my jaw tightening. They didn't get it. They never did, but they would. Because in that moment, standing in my apartment, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white, I made a decision. I was going to get the house back. And when I did, they would never step foot in it again. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every word of that conversation with my mother. My chest burned with a mixture of rage, betrayal, and helplessness. How could they do this? Not just the act of selling the house, but the ease with which they had thrown away something so irreplaceable. My grandparents had built that home from the ground up. They had poured their entire lives into it. Every brick, every floorboard, every faded mark on the walls held a story. It was the house where my grandfather taught me how to ride a bike, where my grandmother baked the best apple pies in the world. It was the one place that had ever truly felt like home. And now, it was gone, because my parents wanted to sip wine in Rome. A hollow feeling settled in my stomach, but I refused to sit in that anger and do nothing. I needed to know everything. Who bought it? Could I get it back? What were my options? I pulled myself out of bed before the sun even rose, my head pounding from the lack of sleep. Grabbing my phone, I scrolled through my recent calls and redialed the number from yesterday. Karen, the real estate agent, answered on the third ring. Mr. Miller? Her voice was hesitant. I'm really sorry about yesterday. I assumed you were informed about the sale. I took a breath, forcing my voice to remain even. Who bought it? There was a brief pause on the other end. I'm afraid I can't disclose that information. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. Karen, please. That house belonged to my family for generations. My parents sold it without telling me, and I exhaled sharply, frustration bubbling beneath my skin. I need to know if there's any way I can buy it back. She hesitated. The buyer is an investor, not a family. I can reach out to them and see if they'd be willing to negotiate, but I can't promise anything. Investor. That meant they didn't care about the house itself, only the profit they could make from it, which meant I had a chance. Do it, I said without hesitation. Tell them I'm willing to make an offer. Karen let out a small sigh. All right, I'll call you back as soon as I have an update. I hung up and leaned back in my chair, my jaw clenched. My parents had taken something that wasn't theirs to sell, but I was going to fix it. I was getting my house back, no matter what it took. The waiting was unbearable. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leapt, only for it to be some spam email or a work notification that I couldn't care less about. Hours passed, then an entire day. I felt restless, pacing my apartment, running every possible scenario in my head. What if the investor had already flipped the house to another buyer? What if they weren't willing to sell? What if they had already started gutting it, tearing down every piece of history left inside? By the time Karen finally called back the next afternoon, I answered before the first ring had even finished. Tell me you have good news, I said, skipping the pleasantries. There was a short pause. The investor is open to selling, she said carefully. But there's a catch. Of course there was. I gritted my teeth. How much? They want 20% more than what they paid for it. I exhaled through my nose, gripping my phone tighter. I had already expected this. Investors weren't sentimental. They only cared about numbers. If they smelled desperation, they'd squeeze every extra dollar they could. That's a hell of a markup, I muttered. It is, Karen agreed, but considering the market, they know someone else would be willing to pay even more if you don't. I ran a hand down my face. The problem wasn't just the inflated price, It was how fast I could pull the money together. My savings were solid, but not enough to buy the house outright, especially with the additional 20%. Financing would take time, and I didn't have the luxury of waiting. "How soon do they need an answer?" I asked. 48 hours. If you don't take it, they'll put it back on the market next week. 2 days. That was all the time I had to come up with the kind of money most people spent years saving for, but I had already made up my mind. "I'll get the money," I said, my voice firm. Karen hesitated. "Ethan, I know this house means a lot to you, but are you sure about this? It's a big financial risk." I wasn't sure of much anymore, but I was sure of this. More sure than I've ever been. The second I hung up, I grabbed my laptop and started doing the math. I had some savings, but it wouldn't be enough. I'd need to liquidate a few investments, maybe even take out a personal loan. I could sell my car if it came to that. Whatever it took. Because I wasn't just buying back a house, I was taking back what was stolen from me. And I'd be damned if my parents ever set foot in it again. The next 48 hours were a blur. I barely slept. My mind was consumed with one thing, getting the money. I wasn't just buying back a house. I was reclaiming a piece of my life that had been stolen from me, and I was willing to do whatever it took. The first thing I did was empty my savings. It hurt seeing the number drop to nearly nothing, but I barely hesitated. This wasn't a want. It was a need. Next, I liquidated my stock investments. I had been saving that money for something big, something meaningful. This was it. Still short. I considered selling my car. The thought stung. Without it, my daily routine would be hell, but I was running out of options. I called the dealership and got an appraisal within hours. It wouldn't cover the full gap, but it would get me close. Not close enough. I stared at my laptop screen, frustration boiling inside me. I was so damn close, but I needed more. Alone? That could take too long. A friend? No way. I wasn't about to drag someone else into this. Then I thought of someone. I hesitated before picking up the phone. I hated asking for favors, but this wasn't just about pride. It was about taking back what was mine. I called James. James had been my best friend since high school. We had been through everything together. College, first jobs, breakups, setbacks, successes. If there was one person I could trust, it was him. He picked up after one ring. "Ethan? Man, it's been a while." I exhaled. "Yeah, I know. Listen, James, I need a favor." A short pause. "Okay. What's going on?" I told him everything. The house, the betrayal, the ridiculous markup, how I had already drained my accounts but still needed more. I wasn't even sure what I expected him to say. Maybe that I was being crazy, that it was just a house, that I should let it go. But James didn't hesitate. "How much do you need?" Relief flooded my chest, but I still hesitated. "James, I wouldn't be asking if I had any other choice." "Dude, shut up," he cut in. "How much?" I told him. "Done," he said immediately. "I'll wire it to you today." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "I'll pay you back." "You don't have to say it," he interrupted again. "Just promise me one thing. Anything. When you get the house back, make sure they know they're never welcome in it again." I felt a slow, satisfied smirk cross my lips. Oh, trust me. That was already the plan. By the end of the day, the money was in my account. I called Karen and told her to let the investor know I was buying the house back. It was mine again, and my parents were about to find out. The moment the paperwork was finalized, a weight lifted from my chest. It was done. The house was mine again. I sat in my car outside the real estate office, gripping the signed documents like they were my lifeline. My grandparents' home, the place that had been stolen from me, was finally back where it belonged. The satisfaction was overwhelming, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. My parents had no idea. They had sold the house behind my back without a second thought. They had spent the money like it was nothing, parading through Europe while I was left to pick up the pieces. They hadn't even considered what this would do to me. Well, they were about to find out exactly how that felt. I drove straight to their house, my grip tightening on the steering wheel with every mile. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my hands were steady, but my blood was boiling. I didn't bother knocking. I walked straight in, and there they were, sitting comfortably in the living room, drinking coffee, as if they hadn't just destroyed my trust. My mother glanced up first, surprised. "Ethan, what a nice surprise. What brings you here?" I tossed the stack of documents onto the coffee table. I bought it back. My father furrowed his brows. "Bought what back?" "The house," I said, my voice sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "The one you sold behind my back. It's mine again." Silence. My mother blinked, staring at the papers like they were written in another language. My father's expression darkened. "You bought it back?" he repeated slowly, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Yes," I snapped. "Since you had no problem throwing away something that wasn't yours to sell, I fixed your mistake." My mother scoffed. "Ethan, you didn't have to do that. We told you, it was just a house." I let out a cold laugh. "Number to you, it was just a house. To me, it was everything." My father folded his arms. "And how exactly did you afford this?" "Not that it's any of your business," I said, "but I made it happen. Unlike you two, I actually care about what our family built." A flicker of something passed over my father's face. Maybe guilt, maybe irritation, maybe both. But my mother was unfazed. "Well," she huffed, "I guess that's your choice. But don't expect us to come visit all the time. We had enough of that place growing up." I smiled. A slow, knowing smile. This was the moment I had been waiting for. "That's the thing, Mom," I said, my voice dripping with satisfaction. "You're never stepping foot in it again." Her eyes widened. "What?" "You heard me," I said, my tone ice cold. "You sold it, remember? You didn't care about it then, so don't expect to care about it now. As far as I'm concerned, you two are banned from the property." The color drained from my mother's face. My father's mouth tightened. "Ethan, don't be ridiculous." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. "Oh, I'm dead serious. You made this decision without me. You spent the money on yourselves. Now you can live with it." My mother looked like she had just been slapped. "You can't do that." "I just did," I said, standing up. "And if you ever try to set foot on that property, I will have you trespassed." My father let out a humorless chuckle. "So what? You're punishing us?" I met his stare without flinching. "No, Dad. I'm teaching you a lesson. Actions have consequences. And you don't get to benefit from something you threw away." My mother's lips parted like she wanted to argue, but she couldn't find the words. My father's jaw was tight, his fists clenched, but he didn't move. For the first time in my life, I had the upper hand. I turned without another word and walked out the door. As I pulled away from the house, I could still hear my mother's voice, sharp and furious, shouting after me, "You're being selfish, Ethan." I didn't even look back. For once, I was putting myself first. The drive back to the house felt different this time. It wasn't just the familiar roads or the way the trees lined the streets exactly as I remembered. It was the feeling of ownership, the knowledge that this place was mine again. No one could take it from me. Not my parents. Not some investor looking to flip it for profit. No one. When I pulled into the driveway, I just sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the house. It looked exactly the same as it had when I was a kid. The white shutters, the wraparound porch, the large oak tree in the front yard where I had once built a treehouse with my grandfather. Except now, the sold sign was staked in the lawn. It made me sick. I stepped out of the car and ripped the sign straight out of the ground, tossing it onto the sidewalk. That was the last reminder of what my parents had done. I took a deep breath and walked up the porch steps. My fingers trembled slightly as I unlocked the door, not from nerves, but from the overwhelming weight of this moment. As soon as I stepped inside, memories came rushing back. The scent of old wood, faint but still there. The way the light streamed through the living room windows in the late afternoon. The familiar creak in the floorboard by the staircase, exactly where it had always been. I had spent so many summers here as a kid, running barefoot through the halls, my grandmother laughing as she chased me with a wooden spoon, pretending to scold me for stealing fresh cookies from the kitchen. But now, the house was eerily silent. It had been empty for weeks, and yet I could still feel the echoes of my childhood here. I ran a hand along the wall, the same one where my grandfather had once marked my height every summer. The faint lines were still there, faded but not forgotten. This wasn't just a house. It was a part of me, and my parents had sold it like it meant nothing. Anger flared in my chest again, but I forced myself to breathe. They didn't win. I had the house back. They had lost all rights to it, and that was their own fault. I walked into the kitchen, flipping on the lights. The countertops were bare, the cabinets empty. It felt strange seeing the place so untouched. It had always been full of life, filled with laughter and warmth. Now it was just a shell, waiting to be revived. And I was going to bring it back to life. But before I could even think about that, I needed to make one thing crystal clear. My parents were never welcome here again. I pulled out my phone and typed a text. Ethan, just so we're clear, you're officially banned from the house. Do not try to visit. Do not call me about it. If I catch you anywhere near the property, I'll have you trespassed. You made your choice. Now live with it. I hit send. Almost immediately, my phone started ringing. My mother. I let it go to voicemail. Then my father. Ignored. A few seconds later, a flood of texts came in. Mom. Ethan, stop being ridiculous. Dad. We're your parents. You don't get to do this. Mom. This is incredibly selfish of you. After all we've done for you? Dad. Enough with the attitude. You're being childish. I stared at the messages, my jaw tightening. After all they had done for me, what exactly had they done? They had taken something precious and sold it behind my back. They had mocked me when I told them how much it meant to me. They had used the money on themselves without even considering how I felt. And now I was the selfish one? I laughed under my breath, shaking my head. I didn't even bother replying. Instead, I locked my phone, set it on the kitchen counter, and looked around the house again. This was mine now, and I was going to rebuild it the way it was always meant to be, with or without them. I woke up early the next morning, stretched out on an air mattress in the middle of the empty living room. The silence was almost overwhelming, but it was a good kind of silence, the kind that reminded me this place belonged to me again. No one could take it away from me. My phone buzzed on the floor beside me. I already knew who it was before I even looked. My parents hadn't given up. Mom, Ethan, you need to call me back. We need to talk about this. Dad, enough with the attitude. You're acting out of spite. Grow up. Mom, we're still family. This is childish and unnecessary. Mom, at least let us come see the house one last time. I rolled my eyes, tossing the phone onto the floor. They didn't get it. They never would. If I responded, it would just give them more reason to argue, more ways to twist the situation and make themselves the victims. I wasn't going to let that happen. I stood up, stretching out my stiff muscles, and took a slow walk through the house, taking in every inch of it. The floors were scuffed, the walls needed a fresh coat of paint, and the furniture was gone, leaving only faint outlines of where the couches and dining table used to be. But it was still my home. I grabbed a notepad from my bag and started making a list. There was work to do. Repairs, furniture, cleaning. It was going to take time to bring the house back to life, but I welcomed the challenge. I started with the basics. The kitchen needed supplies, so I made a run to the nearest store, buying only the essentials: coffee, snacks, some cleaning supplies. By the time I got back, I already felt lighter, more in control. Then, just as I was about to step inside, a car pulled up in the driveway. My stomach dropped. I already knew who it was. My mother stepped out first, dressed in her usual neat blouse and slacks, her hair perfectly styled. My father followed, arms crossed, his expression set in stone. I barely had a second to react before my mother called out, her voice too sweet, too fake. "Ethan! Finally, we've been trying to reach you!" I didn't move. I stood in the doorway, gripping the grocery bags a little tighter. "I saw the messages," I said flatly. "I ignored them on purpose." She let out a small laugh, as if I were joking. "Oh, honey, come on. We just wanted to come see the house. We're your parents. We have a right to—" "No," I cut her off. "You don't." Her smile faltered. "Ethan, stop being so dramatic." I exhaled sharply, stepping forward so there was no mistaking the seriousness in my voice. "You sold this house behind my back. You lied to me. And now that I bought it back, you think you get to waltz in here like nothing happened?" My father scoffed, shaking his head. "You're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be. We had every right to sell it. It was under our name." I clenched my jaw. "And I had every right to buy it back. But guess what? Now it's under my name, and I don't want you here." My mother's expression shifted from fake sweetness to irritation. "Ethan, you're being ridiculous. This is still our family home." "No," I said firmly. "It's not. You gave up that right when you sold it. Now get off my property." Her mouth opened, then closed again. She wasn't used to me standing my ground like this. My father's expression darkened, his patience wearing thin. "Watch your tone," he warned. I let out a short laugh. "Or what? You gonna disown me?" I gestured around. "Newsflash. You already did when you sold this place." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. My mother's lips pressed into a tight line. "Fine," she said stiffly. "If that's how you want to be, we won't force a relationship." I nodded. "Good." She huffed, turning on her heel and storming back to the car. My father lingered for a second, his gaze locked onto mine. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. I didn't blink. "Number, you will." Then I turned and walked inside, shutting the door behind me without another word. And for the first time in years, I finally felt free. The silence that followed after I shut the door was deafening. I leaned against the wood for a second, exhaling, letting the weight of that moment settle. They were gone. For the first time since this whole mess started, I had control. I had set my boundary, and they had no choice but to accept it. I expected to feel guilt, maybe even regret. But instead, all I felt was relief. I locked the door behind me, walking slowly back into the kitchen. My groceries were still sitting on the counter, untouched. I grabbed a bottle of water and took a long sip, staring out the window at the backyard. The oak tree was still there. The one my grandfather had planted decades ago. The one I had climbed 1,000 times as a kid, scraping my knees, dreaming of all the things I'd do when I grew up. I had spent so much time thinking my parents' approval mattered, that if I just worked harder, if I just proved myself, they'd finally respect me, that they'd finally see me as an equal, as someone whose feelings actually mattered. But that had never been the case. They had always put themselves first. And now, it was my turn. My phone buzzed on the counter, dragging me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the screen, fully expecting another round of messages from my parents. But it wasn't them. It was James. James. "So, how did it go?" I smirked and typed back. "Ethan, they showed up. I told them they weren't welcome here anymore." James. "Damn. How'd they take it?" Ethan. "Like you'd expect. Mom tried to guilt trip me. Dad acted like I was throwing a tantrum. Same old story." James. "Let me guess. They called you selfish?" Ethan. "Bingo." James. "Man, they really don't change, do they?" Ethan. "Nope. But I did." I set my phone down, feeling a slow, satisfied calm settle over me. The house was mine. My parents had no say in it anymore. And for the first time in a long time, I was finally putting myself first. The calm didn't last long. By the next morning, my phone was flooded with messages, not just from my parents, but from relatives too. Apparently, my mother had wasted no time making herself the victim. Aunt Linda. "Ethan, I just heard what happened. You seriously told your own parents they can't come to the house?" Uncle Ray. "I don't know what's going on between you and your folks, but banning them from the family home? That's a bit much, don't you think?" Cousin Julia. "Your mom called me crying. She said you won't even let them see the house. What's wrong with you?" I clenched my jaw, scrolling through message after message, each one dripping with the same passive-aggressive guilt tripping. None of them had reached out when my parents sold the house behind my back. None of them cared when I was blindsided, forced to scrape together everything I had to buy it back. But now I was the villain. My mother had spun the story perfectly, painting me as some heartless, ungrateful son who had cruelly shut them out. She had probably left out the part where they betrayed me first. I slammed my phone down on the kitchen counter, my stomach twisting. This was exactly why I had stopped relying on family years ago. They never listened. They never wanted to hear my side, only the version that made my parents look innocent. I wasn't going to waste my breath explaining myself. Instead, I grabbed my phone again and typed out one single message to the family group chat. "Ethan, for those of you who suddenly have an opinion about my decisions, where were you when my parents sold the house behind my back? Where were you when they used the money on themselves and didn't tell me until it was too late?" A pause. The chat was silent. Then I continued. "Ethan, I bought the house back. With my own money. It's mine now. If you don't like the fact that I set boundaries, that's not my problem. I'm done explaining myself." I hit send and tossed the phone aside. Let them talk. Let them whisper behind my back. I didn't owe any of them a damn thing. This house was mine. And no one was going to make me feel guilty about that. The messages slowed down after that, but the damage was done. I had made my stance clear, yet the guilt still lingered. Not because I thought I was wrong, but because it was exhausting having to constantly defend myself for doing what was right for me. I tried to push it out of my mind and focus on the house. There was still so much work to do, and I refused to waste another second on people who had already made it clear that my feelings didn't matter to them. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning. I scrubbed the kitchen, dusted off the bookshelves, and opened every single window to let in the fresh air. The house had been closed up for weeks, and it smelled like it. Stale, empty, forgotten. Not for long. By the afternoon, I had gotten into a rhythm. Music playing from my phone, sleeves rolled up, hands covered in dust and old memories. It felt good, like I was slowly bringing the house back to life, one piece at a time. And then I found it. It happened when I was clearing out one of the upstairs closets, sorting through a pile of old boxes my parents had left behind. At first I thought it was junk. Random papers, old clothes, things they hadn't bothered to take with them. But when I pulled out a heavy, worn envelope with my grandfather's handwriting on the front, my heart stopped. It had my name on it. My breath caught as I carefully opened it, unfolding the letter inside. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded, but the words were still clear. Ethan, if you're reading this, then something has changed. I don't know what the future looks like for you, but I do know one thing. I built this house for our family, and I always hoped it would stay in the hands of someone who truly loves it. I don't know if your parents will feel the same way, but I want you to know this house was meant for you. It was always meant for you. No matter what happens, I hope you fight for the things that matter, because you deserve them. Love, Grandpa. I swallowed hard, my hands tightening around the paper. He knew. Maybe not exactly what had happened, but he knew my parents well enough to see the possibility. He had known they might throw it all away, and he had known that I would be the only one willing to fight for it. I sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the letter, my throat tight. For so long, I had felt crazy for holding on to this house so desperately, for refusing to let it go. But I wasn't crazy. I was just honoring what should have been mine all along. A slow, steady calm settled over me. I had made the right decision, and nothing, not my parents, not my family's judgment, not the weight of their opinions, could change that now. I held the letter for a long time, running my fingers over the faded ink. My grandfather's words felt like a confirmation, proof that I had been fighting for something real, something that mattered. I wasn't wrong. But my parents, they were about to prove, yet again, just how wrong they were. I had barely placed the letter on the nightstand when my phone buzzed again. At first, I was tempted to ignore it. Another relative, another guilt trip, another waste of my time. But this time, it wasn't a message. It was a voicemail from my father. I hesitated before pressing play, lifting the phone to my ear. His voice came through tight and controlled, but I could hear the underlying frustration. Ethan, this has gone on long enough. Your mother is upset, and frankly, so am I. You don't get to make decisions like this without considering how it affects the rest of us. This house was part of our family. You had no right to ban us from it. I scoffed under my breath. No right? You can be angry, fine, but this level of spite is unacceptable. We're coming over. You need to let us in so we can talk about this like adults. Enough of this childish behavior. I pulled the phone away from my ear, staring at it in disbelief. They were coming over. They actually thought they could show up here after everything they had done, as if they were the victims, as if I owed them anything. My jaw tightened. Number not this time. I stood up, rolling my shoulders, feeling a slow, simmering anger settle deep in my chest. If they wanted to show up, fine. Let them. I was ready. I walked downstairs, unlocked the front door, and waited. It didn't take long. Less than 20 minutes later, Their car pulled into the driveway. I stood just inside the doorway, watching as they stepped out, their expressions a mixture of irritation and forced concern. My mother spoke first. "Ethan, honey, we just want to talk." I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Funny, you didn't want to talk when you sold the house." She let out a breath, clearly trying to keep her patience. "We thought we were making the right decision. We didn't think you would react this way." I laughed, shaking my head. "That's the problem. You never think about how your decisions affect me." My father stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Enough of this. We're not here to argue. We just want to see the house." I lifted an eyebrow. "Oh, you want to see the house? The one you were so eager to get rid of? The one you said was just a building?" My mother sighed. "Ethan, don't do this." I straightened up, looking them both dead in the eye. "Number, you don't get to come here and act like nothing happened. You sold this house. You spent the money. And now, suddenly, you care? Why? Because you thought you'd still have access to it? Because you didn't expect me to fight for it?" They didn't answer. I took a slow step forward, my voice steady. "Let me make this easy for you. You are not welcome here. You made your choice. Now you have to live with it." My father's expression darkened. "You're being unreasonable." I smirked. "No, I'm finally being fair. Something you never were with me." My mother's face twisted into frustration. "We're your parents. You don't get to treat us like strangers." I exhaled sharply. "You treated me like a stranger the moment you sold this house without telling me. You made it clear that my feelings didn't matter. Now, I'm just returning the favor." She opened her mouth to argue, but my father grabbed her arm, shaking his head. "Come on, Sharon, let's go." My mother hesitated, looking at me one last time, as if she expected me to change my mind, as if she was waiting for me to break down and let them in. I didn't. I stood my ground, staring back at them, completely unmoved. With a final frustrated huff, she turned, stomping back toward the car. My father followed, though his expression was unreadable. I waited until they were inside, until the engine roared to life. And as they backed out of the driveway, I smiled. For the first time in a long time, I had won. I stood in the doorway long after their car disappeared down the road. The wind rustled the trees, the familiar scent of old wood and fresh air filling my lungs. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. No more games, no more guilt, no more pretending that my parents would ever change. They had made their decision, and I had made mine. This house was mine now. My rules, my boundaries, my future. I stepped back inside, shutting the door behind me, and let out a deep breath. The weight that had been pressing down on me since that first phone call, the gut-wrenching betrayal, the anger, the frustration, was gone. I had won. Not just the house, but the right to finally put myself first. The next few days were a blur of work and restoration. I repainted the walls, fixed the broken cabinet doors in the kitchen, even went outside and trimmed the overgrown bushes near the porch. Every little thing I repaired, every new addition I made, felt like I was reclaiming a part of myself. One afternoon, as I was clearing out the attic, I found something that stopped me cold. An old wooden box. It was tucked away in the corner, covered in a thick layer of dust. When I opened it, I felt my chest tighten. It was filled with old family photos. My grandparents, smiling in front of the house on the day they finished building it. My grandfather sitting on the porch, carving something from wood. Me, as a kid, holding a tiny hammer as he let me help him fix a loose step. Tears pricked the back of my eyes. but I blinked them away. They had always wanted me to have this house, and even though my parents had tried to take that away, they failed. I sat there for a long time, flipping through the photos, letting the memories flood back. This house wasn't just mine. It was a piece of them, still standing, still alive, and I was going to make sure it stayed that way. As I placed the photos back in the box, my phone buzzed beside me. For a split second, I thought it was my parents again, ready to start another fight. But when I glanced at the screen, I saw James' name. James. So, you finally at peace now? I smiled and typed back. Ethan. Yeah, I think I am. Because for the first time in my life, I had taken control. And it felt damn good. The peace didn't last long. I had just started settling into the rhythm of rebuilding the house when, once again, my parents found a way to disrupt it. It started with a letter. A formal-looking envelope arrived in the mail, addressed to me. At first, I thought it was something official, maybe leftover paperwork from the sale. But when I opened it and started reading, my stomach turned. It was from a lawyer. My parents were demanding access to the house. I let out a bitter laugh as I skimmed through the legal jargon. They weren't suing me, not exactly, but they were trying to claim that as my immediate family, they had a right to visit the property whenever they pleased. They were actually trying to force their way back in. My jaw clenched as I dropped the letter onto the kitchen counter. Unbelievable. After everything, they still couldn't accept that this house was no longer theirs. They still thought they had control over me. I picked up my phone and dialed James. He answered on the second ring. Yo, he said, sounding half asleep. What's up? They sent a letter, I said flatly. There was a pause. Who did? My parents, through a lawyer. They're trying to force their way into the house. That woke him up. Wait, what? Are you kidding me? Wish I was. I rubbed a hand over my face, frustration simmering beneath my skin. They're claiming they have a right to visit because they're immediate family. James let out a long whistle. Damn, that's low, even for them. I exhaled sharply. Yeah, I should have seen it coming. What are you gonna do? I didn't hesitate. Fight it. James chuckled. Now that's the Ethan I know. I smirked, but it didn't quite reach my eyes. No way in hell am I letting them pull this. They lost the right to this house the second they sold it behind my back. You need a lawyer? I'll handle it, I said. They don't have a leg to stand on. They sold it voluntarily. They took the money. The house isn't theirs anymore, and it never will be again. Damn right, James muttered. Man, they just can't stand that you finally took something back from them, can they? Apparently not. I hung up a few minutes later, feeling my frustration settle into something sharper. Determination. They thought they could bully their way back into my life. They thought they could manipulate me like they always had. But they were wrong. I grabbed the letter from the counter, crumpled it in my fist, and threw it in the trash. Let them try. They'd already lost. And they were about to learn just how serious I was. I wasn't going to let my parents win. The next morning, I contacted a lawyer of my own. I sent them the letter, along with the full story. How my parents had sold the house behind my back, how I had fought to buy it back, and how they were now trying to weasel their way in after throwing it away. It didn't take long for them to confirm what I already knew. My parents didn't have a case. They voluntarily sold the house, my lawyer said over the phone. They have no legal claim to it anymore. They can try to pressure you, but they don't have a single legal ground to stand on. That was all I needed to hear. I had my lawyer draft a formal response, shutting them down completely. I kept it short and brutal. They had no rights to the house, they would never have rights to the house, and if they continued harassing me, I would file for a restraining order. I sent the letter. Then I waited. It took 2 days before my phone rang. My mother's name flashed across the screen, but I didn't answer. Then came the text messages. Mom, Ethan, we need to talk. This is ridiculous. We're your parents. Mom, why are you doing this? Dad, you've made your point. Enough is enough. Mom, a lawyer? Really? You're treating us like criminals. I didn't reply, because I meant what I said. If they wanted to act like strangers, I would treat them like strangers. And then, just as I thought they might finally give up, my mother sent one last message. Mom, fine. If you want to throw away your family over a house, that's on you. But one day you're going to regret this. And when you do, don't bother coming back to us. I stared at the words for a long moment, then slowly, deliberately, deleted the message. I didn't regret anything. If anyone should be feeling regret, it was them. They were the ones who had thrown me away first. I set my phone down, walked onto the porch, and leaned against the railing, breathing in the cool evening air. The sun was setting, casting golden light over the house. My house. Not theirs, not anyone else's, mine. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. The silence that followed was final. No more messages, no more calls, no more guilt tripping. My parents had made one last attempt to manipulate me, and when they realized it wouldn't work, they did what they always did. They walked away, and I let them, because I was finally done chasing after people who had never truly cared about me. For the next few weeks, I threw myself into rebuilding the house, restoring it, making it my own. Every repair I made, every room I cleaned, every fresh coat of paint. It all felt like I was reclaiming something bigger than just a house. I was reclaiming myself. One evening, as I was unpacking an old box, I found my grandfather's letter again. I sat down on the couch, running my fingers over the faded paper, rereading his words. No matter what happens, I hope you fight for the things that matter. I smiled. I had fought. I had stood my ground. I had taken back what was mine, and I didn't regret a single thing. As I folded the letter and placed it in a frame to hang on the wall, my phone buzzed beside me. A message from James. James, beer tonight? You need a break from playing HGTV in that house. I laughed under my breath, typing back. Ethan, fine. But you're paying. I'm broke. James, dude, you literally just bought a house. Obviously. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. But before I stepped out, I turned, taking one last look at the house, the place I had fought for, the place that was finally, completely mine. I took a deep breath, let it all sink in, and smiled. Because for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be.